Imagine waking up one morning, making your coffee, scrolling through your phone, and stumbling across a headline that stops you cold. Something like, Scientists confirm all humans share one common mother. And your first reaction is probably something like, okay, sure, whatever. We all came from somewhere, right? But then you keep reading, and the more you read, the more your brain starts doing this uncomfortable thing where it tries to wrap itself around a concept so massive, so staggering, that the coffee in your hand suddenly feels very small and very irrelevant. Because here's the thing, this isn't mythology, this isn't religion, this isn't some ancient story passed down around a fire. This is cold, hard, peer reviewed, laboratory confirmed science. And what it says is this: every single human being alive on Earth today, all 8 billion of us, traces our maternal lineage back to one single woman. One woman, not a goddess, not a myth. A real, breathing, living human woman who walked this Earth, probably somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. She had a mother. She had a childhood. She probably had bad days. She had no idea, absolutely zero concept, of what she was about to set in motion. And yet, here we are. All of us. Every president, every farmer, every astronaut, every person who has ever annoyed you in a grocery store checkout line. All of us connected to her. So who was she? How do we know she existed? And why her? Why this one woman out of all the women who ever lived? That's what we're here to find out. Before we get into the science, we need to talk about something that trips people up almost immediately when they first hear about this. Because the moment most people hear we all descended from one woman, their brain does a very predictable thing. It immediately jumps to a biblical comparison. It thinks, oh, so scientists found Eve, the original woman, the first human female, and that is not what happened. That is not what this is at all. The woman scientists are referring to has actually been nicknamed Mitochondrial Eve. But she was not the first woman. She was not the only woman alive at her time. There were plenty of other women walking around during her lifetime, eating, surviving, having children of their own. She was not some solitary figure standing alone at the dawn of humanity. What made her special? What makes her the woman every living human descends from is something far more interesting than simply being first. And understanding it requires us to take a quick detour into one of the most fascinating corners of biology. Inside nearly every cell in your body, you have these tiny structures called mitochondria. You might remember them from high school biology, the powerhouse of the cell, as every teacher has said approximately 10,000 times. But mitochondria are interesting for a reason that goes way beyond energy production. Unlike almost every other part of your DNA, mitochondrial DNA is not a mix of your mother and your father. It doesn't shuffle. It doesn't blend. When your mother passed her mitochondrial DNA down to you, she passed it down almost completely unchanged. And her mother passed it to her. And her mother's mother passed it to her, and so on, going back through an unbroken maternal chain, mother to child, stretching thousands of generations into the past. This makes mitochondrial DNA an extraordinary tool, because if you can read it, if you can sequence it and compare it across populations around the world, you can essentially reverse engineer human ancestry. You can trace all of those maternal lines backward, watching them converge, watching them narrow, until eventually all of them lead back to one single woman. And that's exactly what scientists did. In 1987, a team of researchers at UC Berkeley, Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson, published a paper in the journal Nature that turned the scientific world on its head. They analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 147 people representing populations from around the globe. And when they ran the analysis, when they traced all of those maternal lineages backward, they all converged. Not at multiple origin points, not at dozens of ancient women, at one. One common mitochondrial ancestor for every human alive today. The paper was an earthquake. The term Mitochondrial Eve was born, and suddenly millions of people were confronted with a question that felt simultaneously ancient and brand new. Who was this woman? Here's where the story gets genuinely mind-bending. because figuring out when she lived required scientists to essentially use DNA as a clock. Mitochondrial DNA mutates very slowly, very predictably, but it mutates. And because researchers have a rough idea of how fast those mutations accumulate, what's called the molecular clock, they can look at how different various human mitochondrial DNA sequences are from each other and work backward to estimate how long ago they all shared a common ancestor. When they ran those calculations, the numbers pointed to somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Deep in the Pleistocene epoch, a world that looked nothing like ours. A world of megafauna and shifting climates and small bands of humans who were, in many ways, incredibly vulnerable. And this woman, Mitochondrial Eve, was alive somewhere in that world, almost certainly in Africa. The evidence for this is overwhelming. African populations today show far greater mitochondrial DNA diversity than populations on any other continent. In genetics, diversity equals time. The more diverse a gene pool is in a particular region, the longer humans have been accumulating mutations there. Africa's extraordinary genetic diversity is one of the clearest signals we have that it is where our species, and therefore where she, originated. Now, here is the part that absolutely breaks people's brains, and I want you to really sit with this, because it's important. Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive. We already covered that. But here's the follow-up question that doesn't get asked enough. What happened to all the other women? Because they existed. There were other women, contemporaries of mitochondrial Eve, who also had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Some of their descendants survived for thousands of years. So, why don't we carry their mitochondrial DNA? The answer comes down to a phenomenon that sounds almost cruel when you say it out loud: lineage extinction. All it takes is one generation where a woman has no daughters. Sons don't pass mitochondrial DNA on, that's the rule. A son carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA, but when he has children, those children inherit their mother's mitochondrial line, not his. So, if a woman's line, at any point across thousands of generations, hits a generation with no daughters, the chain breaks. The mitochondrial lineage dies out. Not the descendants themselves, just that particular thread of maternal DNA. Over tens of thousands of years, this happened again and again, lineage after lineage slowly blinking out, until only one remained. Mitochondrial Eve was the last woman standing in a very specific, very unusual sense. She was the last woman whose unbroken maternal line survived all the way to the present day. Every other line eventually hit that dead end, a generation without daughters, and was absorbed into the human gene pool in every other way except for mitochondrial DNA. This means Mitochondrial Eve's status as our common maternal ancestor wasn't something she earned through power or survival alone. It was, in a very real sense, a matter of probability that played out across geological time. She happened to be the one whose unbroken chain of daughters never, ever broke, across more than 100,000 years of human history. Think about that for a second. An unbroken line of mothers and daughters. For 150,000 years, every single generation, her line produced at least one daughter who went on to have at least one daughter of her own. That is an extraordinary run of continuity across the noise and chaos of human existence. But here's something else worth noting, because it adds another layer to the complexity of this story. Mitochondrial Eve was not the most recent common ancestor of all humans. That's a different person entirely. And that person lived much, much more recently. You see, Mitochondrial Eve is our most recent common maternal ancestor, meaning she's the most recent common ancestor we can trace exclusively through the mother-to-mother line. But humans inherit DNA from both parents. And when you factor in all possible ancestral lines, not just the unbroken maternal one, the math works out differently. Population geneticists have calculated that the most recent common ancestor of all living humans, the Most recent person from whom every person alive today descends through some line of ancestry, maternal or paternal or any combination, probably lived only about 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, possibly even more recently. That's shockingly recent. We're potentially talking about someone who lived during the Bronze Age, someone whose world included written language, organized agriculture, early empires, someone who, if you told them that in a few thousand years every living human would call them a common ancestor, would probably think you'd lost your mind. But that's how exponential ancestry works. Go back far enough, and everyone's family trees start sharing branches. Go back even further, and those branches become the same trunk. And mitochondrial Eve sits near the base of that trunk. Not at the very bottom, but deep enough that her position there is one of the most profound facts about our species. Now I want to pivot because there's a companion to mitochondrial Eve that doesn't get nearly as much attention, and she deserves to be part of this conversation. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Her name in the scientific literature is Y-chromosomal Adam. And yes, the naming convention is deliberate. And yes, scientists do have a sense of humor. Y-chromosomal Adam is to the paternal line what mitochondrial Eve is to the maternal line. He's the most recent man from whom all living men today trace their Y chromosome ancestry. The Y chromosome, like mitochondrial DNA, passes almost unchanged from father to son. No reshuffling, no blending, a direct paternal thread stretching back through time. And here's where it gets interesting. Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve did not live at the same time. Current estimates place Y-chromosomal Adam somewhere between 200,000 and 340,000 years ago, significantly earlier than mitochondrial Eve's estimated 150,000 to 200,000 years. They were not a couple. They probably didn't even come close to existing in the same era. The names Adam and Eve were applied somewhat poetically because, and this is worth repeating, neither of them was the first human. They were simply the last to maintain an unbroken single-sex lineage to the present day. They could not have found each other even if they'd wanted to. The math doesn't allow it, and the fact that the paternal and maternal common ancestors are separated by potentially 100,000 years or more is one of the things that makes human population genetics so endlessly fascinating. So what was her life actually like? This is where we have to exercise some intellectual humility because mitochondrial Eve left no diary, no cave paintings that we can definitively attribute to her, no artifacts with her name on them. What we know about her comes entirely from inference, from archaeology, anthropology, climatology, and genetics working together to paint a picture of what life was like for anatomically modern humans in sub-Saharan Africa around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. And what that picture shows is a world that was simultaneously recognizable and utterly alien. The humans of mitochondrial Eve's time were, biologically, indistinguishable from us. Same brain size, same physical capabilities, same capacity for language, for complex thought, for planning and creativity. In a very real sense, if you could take a baby from her era and raise it in the modern world, that child would be completely, entirely one of us. But the world around them was profoundly different. The population of anatomically modern humans at that time was shockingly small. Some estimates suggest there may have been only tens of thousands of humans alive at certain points during this period, possibly fewer. The species that would eventually sprawl across every continent and build cities and fly to the moon was, at that moment in time, not so different from any other endangered primate clinging to survival in a fluctuating African climate. Mitochondrial Eve's group, whatever band of humans she belonged to, was navigating a landscape shaped by dramatic climate shifts. The African continent was cycling through periods of intense drought that would have fragmented habitats, isolated populations, and put enormous pressure on survival. There's evidence that around 70,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years after mitochondrial Eve, the human population may have crashed to as few as 10,000 individuals in what's known as a population bottleneck, possibly triggered in part by the eruption of the Toba supervolcano in Indonesia. Mitochondrial Eve predates that bottleneck, but her world was no less precarious. Every generation was a negotiation with an environment that was not particularly interested in human flourishing. And yet, her line survived. Through droughts and predators and disease and competition and every conceivable obstacle that 150,000 years of Earth can throw at a living creature, her line held. Her daughters had daughters, and those daughters had daughters, all the way to the present day. One of the questions people ask, and it's a fair one, is whether the discovery of mitochondrial Eve has any implications beyond the purely scientific. Does it matter in a practical sense to know that we all share this one common maternal ancestor? There's a reasonable argument that yes, it does. Not because it changes how we go about our daily lives, but because of what it quietly dismantles. The concept of deeply separate human groups, of people so fundamentally different from one another that they might as well be different species. Mitochondrial Eve makes that idea scientifically incoherent. Not just philosophically problematic, not just morally questionable, but scientifically incoherent. Because if you trace any two human beings' maternal lines back far enough, you hit the same woman. Every time, without exception. The genetic differences between any two human populations are, by the standards of most other species on Earth, extraordinarily small. Humans are a remarkably young species. We haven't had nearly enough time to develop the kind of deep genetic divergence you see in, say, different subspecies of chimpanzee. And the reason we know that so precisely is in large part because of the work done around mitochondrial Eve and the field of population genetics that her discovery energized. We are, quite literally, one extended family. An absurdly large, geographically scattered, culturally diverse extended family, but a family nonetheless. Every human alive today is at most a very distant cousin of every other human alive today. The branches of our family tree go in wildly different directions, but they all eventually connect. They have to. The math demands it. Since 1987, the science has not stood still. DNA sequencing technology has advanced at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction to Rebecca Cann and her colleagues working with their 147 samples. Today, researchers can sequence entire mitochondrial genomes, all roughly 16,500 base pairs, from thousands of individuals across hundreds of populations, with a speed and accuracy that was unimaginable just a few decades ago. And what have those advances shown? They've refined the estimates. They've deepened our understanding of migration patterns, how humans moved out of Africa, when they arrived in Europe and Asia and the Americas and Australia, how populations separated and reunified over millennia. They've revealed that modern humans interbred with other archaic human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, leaving traces of those ancient encounters in the genomes of people living today. The picture has become more complex, more nuanced, more surprising with every passing year of research. But the fundamental finding that there is one woman at the root of every living human's maternal lineage has not wavered. It has been tested, retested, and confirmed across decades and across datasets that dwarf what was available in 1987. The science is, at this point, about as settled as science gets. What has shifted, and continues to shift, is our understanding of exactly when and where she lived, and of the broader population context in which she existed. Researchers now emphasize that mitochondrial Eve was part of a diverse, complex human population, not an isolated individual. She was embedded in a community. She had relationships. She lived and died within a social structure that we can barely begin to imagine from the fragmentary evidence available to us. The science sees her clearly as a data point, the convergence of a billion maternal lines. The human imagination, understandably, wants more than that. Wants to know her name, her face, what she loved, what frightened her, what she thought about when the sun went down over whatever African landscape she called home. There's a thought experiment worth sitting with before we wrap this up. Imagine you could go back in time. Not to photograph her or interview her, just to stand at a distance and watch. You would see a woman who looks completely, entirely human. She might be carrying a child. She might be gathering food or tending to a fire or laughing with someone in her group. And you would have absolutely no way of knowing, standing there, that you were looking at the woman from whom every living human being on Earth would eventually descend. She would have no way of knowing it either. She would have been focused on whatever humans in that era were focused on: survival, belonging, the immediate needs of her family and her community. The vast reach of her future lineage would have been entirely invisible to her. And that, maybe more than anything else in this story, is what makes it so strangely moving. She didn't set out to be the mother of humanity. She didn't do anything extraordinary, at least not in any way that her contemporaries would have recognized as extraordinary. She simply lived. She had children, her daughters had children, and across 150,000 years and more than 6,000 generations, that chain of life held unbroken while every other comparable chain around her, one by one, faded away. The ordinary acts of one woman's life, caring for her children, surviving another season, passing on whatever she knew to whoever would listen, turned out to be the thread from which all of humanity is woven. So when someone asks you, which woman did every living human descend from? The answer is a real woman, not a mythological one, who lived somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. A woman who shared the world with other humans and other lineages that have since been extinguished by the random, relentless arithmetic of generational survival. A woman whose mitochondrial DNA, that tiny, quiet, almost incidental strand of biological information, has been copied and passed down and copied again across more human lives than we will ever be able to fully count. She has no known name, no tomb, no monument, no culture that worshipped her as a goddess, at least not that we know of. But she has something rarer than any of those things. She has every single one of us. And that might be the most extraordinary legacy in the history of life on this planet.